Awesome. Okay, so yeah, just let me know if they stop. So today we're going to be covering mainly the book Love Thy Body. And the book is written by an author named Nancy R. Pearcey. And I hope I'm saying her name right. And basically the whole synthesis of the book is that we have to stop thinking of our bodies as just material, but actually as something made by God to serve a purpose. So starting with that, why love thy body? Well, we have two major questions in society that we have to answer. One, is the body central to who I am? And if so, to what degree? And how should we understand human dignity? These are two major questions that we see throughout all of society right now. We see it hugely on the trans issue, obviously, but we even see it in things like abortion and also the hookup culture as well. We see it in these three facets. And so, how we answer these questions are then going to determine a major part of our worldview and how we then act out that worldview. Now, I think what's important to know right here is we're not saying that from like a materialist point of view that all the human body is all we are. Because we have to remember as Christians, we hold that we are body and soul. We're not just one or not just the other. So I think that is an important thing to keep in the background. So now going from there, you might have heard something called personhood dualism or just dualism, mind-body dualism. These are kind of names that roughly mean the same thing, but we're going to apply them a little differently. So as you notice, we have this, oops, I forgot, I need a marker. There we go, laser pointer. As you can see, we have this like two-tiered system, as you could say. Oh, were you going to say something, Ranger? And by the way, stop me at any moment if you have a question or anything you want to mention. Yes. And we're actually, let me just quickly go through this here. Ah, crap, I don't cover it. But yes, so that is another way dualism has been used, as you said, as describing the material as evil and the spirit in heaven as good. Now, I think we have to remember, and you do see this actually in a lot of Christian circles, and it's in some part kind of actually Gnostic in origin. And what I mean by that is the Gnostics thought that the material realm, as you said, was evil or something to be desired, and that the highest state of being was to basically shed our mortal bodies and become a spirit. And I think we do see this in Christian circles a lot of time. So a lot of times when people think, "Oh, what happens when I die?" Oh, well, I just go to heaven. Well, you don't just go to heaven. First of all, heaven isn't as we think, which is just this like immaterial space where like floating like I don't know, Casper the Ghost, right? And we have our little harps and we sing blah blah blah. All right, that's not what heaven is, first of all. And second off, that's not where we finally end up. We end up on the new earth and new heavens, and those are very physical. When Paul is talking about how we will achieve new bodies, glorified bodies, he's talking about physical bodies. And so we have to remember that just because something is material doesn't mean it's evil or that it's lesser than. After all, God made the world and he didn't make a lesser creation. So I think that's important to remember. And we have to remember also, so if we go back to Genesis, for example, it says humans were made to subdue and rule the earth. Well, there you go. Like the earth is meant to serve a purpose and we are meant to then rule it. And that is true even in the new earth. And it's something that we're supposed to take care of. Oh, no worries. Actually, it's funny you say that because that actually, she talks about that in the book. She breaks up the dichotomy as in the top she has the sacred, and at the bottom she has the material. And she talks about how Christians do this two-tiered or two-floored system. But anyways, going back to this. So you can see these different two-tiered systems, and we can do this with a lot of different thought. Now, there's sort of some characteristics that are important to remember. So the top one, you'll notice how it has value here. This is true across the line. Okay, so value, and by value I mean things like moral value, not like a number. Those value propositions, that's always true on the top row. And then the bottom one is, as I have here, fact. So just statements, just like a truth. And those are on the bottom. Now, these things are separated. So the value side and the fact side are considered completely separate. They're not connected. in these tiered systems. And so, as you can see, like when it comes to value, it's something that's private, subjective, and relative. Basically, meaning it's something you keep to yourself. It's something you believe. You might hear examples of like, oh, well, my truth, right? So that's an example of this value proposition, or things people might say like, oh, well, your morals are good for you, but that's not good for me. You know, stuff like that. And when we look around, look down this sort of list of 3 different major thoughts, we have Western thought, and we get that in postmodernism. And the way postmodernists use it is they care only about what's in the mind. So how they view the mind is you're looking out into the world, and then the objective world doesn't really exist. It's just whatever is in your mind. And so that's what separates a postmodernist from, like, say, a modernist, where a modernist doesn't care about the mind. Like, all that matters is the objective facts in the world, and what you think is totally irrelevant to them. Now, there's certain truths to both of these, right? So something that's true about the postmodernists is that we do have a mind independent from the body. That we aren't just purely material beings that are, floating through space. But the modernists are correct in thinking that, hey, just because I think something about the world doesn't therefore make it true. Like, there are actual objective truth claims in the world. And so you can sort of see areas where there's some truth in both of them, but they are not a complete picture of the world. And when we look at personhood theory, we have, on the top system, we have a person. So you could think of that as the mind, right? So that they have moral and legal standing. So, for example, when you hear people talk about abortion, right, the question is, well, is it really a person? Well, this is sort of what the conversation is about, right? Because if we look at the body, right, the body is just your physical, your literal physical body. And when people are talking about personhood, sometimes you'll have pro-lifers who are, well, don't you know that it's a human life, right? Like, I'm looking at biology, and look, it check marks, it's a human life, clearly. But when people are talking about personhood and whether or not someone has value, the fact that someone has who's alive biologically is irrelevant to them. Why? Because this is all they care about. This is the only thing that they have decided has moral and legal standing. And I think something else that's important to mention is that just because someone might not have these deep philosophical ideas, right? I mean, I doubt you'll run into someone who's like, here's my, I read a dozen papers, and here's my philosophical grounding for personhood. No one does that, except for a bunch of people in academia, right? But when we make certain claims about the world, and when you listen to people talk, we're all making philosophical statements about the world, even if we're not aware of the necessary foundations that we're building them upon. If that makes sense. And so, talking about this, when we look at the Christian worldview, what we realize is, hey, we don't have this dichotomy of like, oh, well, the soul only matters, or the mind, and that, oh, only the body matters, or the material. Actually, people are both. You're both body and soul. What is a human is someone who has a body and has a soul. It's not that you just have a soul, and it's not that you just have a body. And we can look at some verses in the Bible, for example, in Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So this is sort of talking about the soul aspect. This also implies a moral worth that's added, since things made in the image of God, just as a derivative of God, necessarily have to have moral worth. And then when we look at Psalms, certainly you made me, you made my mind and heart. You wove me together in my mother's womb. I will give you thanks because your deeds are awesome and amazing. You knew me thoroughly, expressing the intimate value and knowledge God has for each. Oh yeah, I forgot to delete this. You knew me thoroughly, right? And the whole point of this is, again, that we have an innate value from God, and that he knows each person intimately from conception up until death. So, before I move on, does all of this make sense to everyone? Or are there any questions or thoughts? And I don't mind going off track. I think it's interesting. Oh, and you can tell me to slow down too if I'm talking too fast. Okay. Moving on. So when we look at moral and ethics, right? So if we look we talked about this when we were talking about the moral argument, but from a secular point of view, when we look at things like moral, they're completely relative and are all human dependent. So that's one important thing. And another important thing about the secular worldview is that human beings don't have any innate worth. There's nothing particularly special about a human versus, let's say, a cat versus a piece of corn or whatever, right? And they're all fundamentally just material things that exist. And because of that, it then isn't surprising that we do run into some of the moral issues of our society. Because if we say that the human being, or at least the human body, let's say that, because, obviously you have some people who want to talk about personhood and all that stuff. If the human body is just, it's just a raw material to do with whatever I wish, then that's naturally going to imply some moral claims. It's going to, for example, if someone is like, well, I'm going to change my body because I think I should be this way. Well, then there's nothing wrong with them doing that. Why? Because the human body is just material. It's like, imagine like wood. It's just something that you then use and transform. It doesn't have any innate value in itself. You even get this with, again, things like abortion, right? Where you're sure, it's a human body, but does it have any more worth? Well, no, because it's not a person. So we see that as another example. And we'll talk about, we'll pretend, maybe watch a video where we can really see that very clear. And so going from the secular point of view, going from the Christian worldview, when we look at the Christian worldview, we obviously believe that morals are objective. There's purpose because, God innately, when he designs something, he designs it with a purpose in mind. And because of that, when we look at human beings, we then say, oh, well, they also have an innate moral worth beyond just quote unquote raw material. The human body was made and designed for a purpose and has value that can't just be, flippantly played with. And what we also see is that God has subjected his moral law on us as well, which is, again, a reflection of his character and his intentions with creation. Does all of this make sense to everyone? Awesome. So, moving on. Now, let's take our two-tiered system and try to apply it to something that's a big topic in society. So let's look at something like abortion, right? So on the top of our two-tiered system, we have the mind, which is a free autonomous self. This is sort of our definition in a way, or at least like, let's say, properties of a mind that we're then using to define it. On the bottom, we have the body, which is just a mechanism operated by the natural laws, which is just to say a material thing. If you could imagine like a mech analogy, right, where you might have a human mind operating a mech, right, and the mech is just your body. So then a big question that comes up in abortion all the time, which is, who/what determines what is a person? Well, why does this matter? Well, it's because all moral value only cares about this. Only cares about this under the secular worldview. And so since all moral value is in this, then this becomes the ultimate question of when is it okay to kill someone versus not. And the quote, Francis Crick, no newborn infant should be declared human until past certain tests regarding its genetic endowment, and if it fails these tests, it forfeits its right to life. So to sort of give you an idea of what he's getting at, is because if we determine that the mind is the ultimate determiner of human worth, then theoretically you can come up with criteria, and if a being does not meet this criteria, then we don't consider them worth human life. So to give an example, Steven Pinker was one time asked, I believe it was Steven Pinker, he was asked by someone, and what he said is, let's say I have a dog, right, and it shows these signs of intelligence, but, a baby, they really don't show these levels. Like, we can imagine, like, an adult dog is probably smarter than, like, an infant. And it says, okay, so is it okay if let's say I put down my dog for whatever reason, maybe it's inconvenient or something. And it's like, okay, well, maybe it's probably okay. Okay, then why shouldn't I do that with a child? And of course, the answer is he doesn't have one. Why? Because he's determining the human worth based on what a being is capable of doing. And I think that is a pretty huge issue because it logically then leads to things like infanticide and eugenics. Eugenics is a big one, right? Where you can imagine, oh, well, this person doesn't show the qualities necessary to count as a person, so therefore, it's okay to kill them. Because after all, they're not any more intelligent than any other animal. And I think a really good example is can really be seen in this video. I'll probably post the video in the apologetics channel, and it'll be sort of up to you to decide if you want to watch it. It is highly mature, just as a sort of warning. So just because of that, I'll leave it up to people to decide if they want to watch it or not. But I really would highly recommend it. Yes, he is mentioned. Fenoward's not bad, especially on the pro-life stuff. He's very good. I actually have one of his books called Persuasive Pro-Life. I haven't read it yet, but it's a good book. But again, like going on before, something that's sort of talked about in the video is Trent Horn asked Destiny, and Destiny's a pretty big sort of left-leaning streamer on Twitch and on YouTube, and he's pro-choice, and he asked him, okay, so let's imagine you had a baby, and because the way Destiny would determine human worth is again by these criteria of personhood, which is independent, conscious, blah blah blah, all this stuff. And basically what Trent Horn asked him is, okay, so let's imagine I just snipped the brainstem, pre-utero, so hasn't been born yet, but we basically snip it, and then they're not capable of becoming conscious. Could we then take that and then just use its body basically for whatever purpose we want? Use it as a raw resource. Use the stem cells for X, Y, and Z. Use the, maybe you can use the heart for something, use it for that, just take it and break it down to its raw components and then use it. And what Destiny basically said is, yeah, that's perfectly fine. And I think that highlights just the absolute lack of morality that's in this worldview. Because if you can do that, then why don't we do that, let's say, with, again, why don't we just run factories like this, right? You could imagine you have an artificial womb, and now you're just running factories where you're taking these people and you're permanently making them unconscious just so that way you can use them to do things. It's straight out of Warhammer 40k. It's horrifyingly dark, and I think that the average person really doesn't realize how dark it is that some of these worldviews can get. Because again, as I mentioned here, if the body's a mere resource, why not use human experimentation? Why not do stem cell stuff? Why not just create mindless dolls that you then use for whatever purposes you want? Implant a chip and make them do things, And it goes down a dark view pretty quickly, but you have to admit it is logically consistent. Because again, if the human body is just this raw material, has no innate worth in itself, then it can be used however it wants. Which is highly juxtaposed from the Christian worldview, which does say that the human body is a holy temple, that it does have moral worth, and that it's something meant to be taken care of. I'll wait till both of you are done typing before I go on. I haven't seen What Is It by Living Waters. I'll have to check it out. And what I would say, we're talking about this, oh, well, who cares? You're just talking about how this logically leads to this leads to that. What I think is important is what this is showing is, hey, the Christian worldview, whenever you have a worldview and you're looking out into the world, you have to say, hey, does this worldview jive with what I'm seeing in the world? And the whole point of saying this is that the Christian, and what we're trying to say really is pointing out a consistency within the Christian worldview that, hey, Christian worldview can take into account all these facts and does offer an accurate picture of the world. That, hey, the human mind and body can't just be separated, that there are effects on both, and that they both will have both have moral worth tied to them. That there isn't this binary. Then, if we move on things towards euthanasia, right? you often hear when people talk about euthanasia, especially of the mentally disabled, is, oh, well, their quality of life will be worse. So therefore, you just might as well kill them. After all, you don't want them to live this horrible subpar life and, insert whatever else. And what I find so interesting about that is it's so incredibly disrespectful to the human being, right? Because you're not viewing that person as another person, right? You're saying, oh, well, obviously they're disabled. And so now I'm just going to treat them as basically a sub person. Because if you found, like, let's say you have a vet, right? They went to war, they lose an arm. You wouldn't be like, oh, well, this man's quality of life is going to be pretty bad. So we might as well just commit suicide. I mean, I guess unless you're the Canadian government, because the Canadian government does suggest that. But if you're a decent country who cares about your vets, obviously you'd be like, hey, that's kind of insane. But just because you're going to have a lower quality of life doesn't therefore mean that we should just end it. It means we should look at ways on how we can then help the person. And you're not helping someone by just ending their life. It's the most, like, lazy way possible. Like, oh, well, it's going to be hard to help this person, so I might as well just remove the person from the picture. Then I don't have to help anyone. It's incredibly disrespectful and definitely dehumanizing, to say the least. And sort of another point she pointed out in the book is that when we do think like this of, oh, well, their quality of life is going to be bad or they're going to suffer, blah, blah, so therefore we might as well end it. It then causes us to not look at ways on how we can improve someone's life because we'll just look at the very easy solution. And then you can sort of end in the spiral where, because you're just thinking of, well, this is sort of the easy solution, this is how we're going to do it, then you don't actually spend time trying to think, oh, well, how can I actually just make it better? If that makes sense. Does anyone have any other questions before we move on? Yep. So then when we look at hookup culture, we have the same sort of binary, right? So on the top, we have the personal, this is the mental emotional relationship, and then the physical is just, you doing the deed, right? And what's fascinating is when you look at hookup culture and you look at what people say, it's like, oh, well, this professor talks about how she would have students come up to her and talk about how you're trying to separate the mind from it. It's like, it's not that they try to disconnect the having sex from the relational aspect, and I think you can somehow separate the two. Like, you can separate your mind and be like, oh, well, I'm just doing the physical act. There's no other connection I'm having. And that is simply just not possible. As more science has been done on this issue, it is proven again and again and again. You cannot separate the two. What you do to your body will affect your mind, and what you do in your mind will affect your body. And this is a great example of that, because as you look into people who are very promiscuous and you ask them, like, oh, how's your life being? Sometimes you'll get answers like, oh, well, it's fine, it has no effect on me. And then when you analyze them, you'll see, oh, well, they have high rates of depression. They feel unvalued. They feel like they're just treated like a meat puppet. I saw a clip a couple weeks back on a lady who had slept with 100 men all in one day to set some stupid world record. And this guy, I guess he did a documentary, and they show a clip at the very end when she's at the end of this day, and you basically see her breaking down mentally. And it's no wonder that it's the way. Human beings were meant to be monogamous and relational. They were not meant for this. All the studies show this. And when you try to fight biology, you don't end up beating biology because you can never beat reality. Reality always wins. It's the greatest champion of all time. All you do is just hurt yourself and then dilute yourself into not recognizing the issue. Because again, if you think about hookup culture, you're really just treating the body of yourself and the other person as just basically pleasure tools. That's all they are. You're completely removing the fact that they're a human, opinions, personality, value, all that. You're just removing that. And you're just viewing them as the ultimate tool for your pleasure. Well, if you're going to dehumanize someone like that, naturally you have to recognize that you are also being dehumanized in the same way. So, how would you expect there not to be mental and emotional effects from that? It seems just so blatantly common sense to me. You're right. It is the ultimate form of objectification, and it's a great moral evil too. I find it's so funny to me. I guess not really funny, but funny in the sarcastic sense. You know, in a society that's constantly talking about objectification and dehumanization, they will go through leaps and bounds to try to justify how this is somehow not the most dehumanizing thing possible. Yes. Thank you, helping writer. It's you're literally just treating each other as tools. Like if you replace either one with a robot, there would effectively be no difference. And if you're gonna view someone as if they're basically just a robot, like I don't know what to tell you. Like that's just gonna be degrading. It's degrading to yourself and it's degrading to others. And just because you consent to degrade yourself doesn't mean you're not degrading yourself. Just as someone consents to take meth, it doesn't mean that meth is not going to affect them. Okay. But it's so stupid. Society, it's so backwards. And I think it's interesting because you are starting to see some pushback in some groups. But you'll see it almost in some ways the issue we recognize, but then the solution won't be. So you'll get this with, let's say, the Red Pill Bros or the Manosphere group on YouTube, right? Where they'll point out an issue, they'll be like, "Hey, promiscuity's bad. It leads to this. You're devaluing yourself. Blah blah blah," right? And then they'll be like, "That's true." So the way we fight that is polygamy, and it's like, no, what are you talking about? No, that's not how you solve it. The way you solve it is going back to Christian values. You don't solve it by just being like, it's bad when women do it, but not when men do it. You know, it's so stupid. Once people recognize, like, hey, we both have extreme moral worth, and I'm not going to degrade you because that's actually wrong, and you're not going to degrade me because that's also wrong. Then we can start having productive, quality relationships, just as God intended. Because it turns out, when God made the world and everything, and put purpose in stuff, if you then go against the purpose, it's going to be bad. Like, shocking. And so the reason why I have this picture is because I thought it was kind of interesting. And I thought it was interesting because, you have they list different types of relationships. So platonic, romantic, codependent, casual, open, and then toxic. And what I found interesting is you look at the definition, talk to them. It's an unhealthy relationship that harms you emotionally, physically, and psychologically. Casual, open, both of these harm you. There's no way to harm you. All the data that's been done on polygamy and stuff shows that it is immensely detrimental to your mental health and emotional well-being. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. This has been studied repeatedly. Horrible for you. And especially for the women, and even for the guys, because it ends up creating a very bad society in which what you end up is with increased aggression, increased violence. Often you get hyper rebellions because of this. So I give you an example. A modern day example is let's look at China, for example, right? So in China, there's I forget how many men per woman, but it's crazy. Not quite double digits, but it's I believe it's over 2 times. It's an absurd number, right? So you have all these single guys that will never have a relationship with someone. It is just literally not possible. Yeah, I think you're right helping around it. I think it is about 3-1. Like that's just going to have massive negative societal consequences because you have a bunch of people who have literally no prospect of marriage whatsoever. Well, how the heck do you do that? Well, you need to lower the amount of men. And how do you do that? Through violence. It's incredibly unstable. It's the reason why the successful modern societies, for the, I want to say completely, there are a handful of exceptions I can think of, and they're very small exceptions. All favor monogamy. There's a reason why monogamy is a common characteristic amongst a lot of societies. And it's because when you don't, you have very negative consequences that then come from that worldview. Again, this has been studied. There's no two ways about it. Like, you can try to fight reality as much as you can, but you'll never beat it. So, talking about that, one thing I talked about last week is, hey, we should also remember that, hey, sex is a good thing when used in its proper context. It's not that it's a bad thing. It's not that it's a bad thing that we should have shoved in the corner and pretend doesn't exist. No, it's a good thing that God designed, but it has to be done in its proper context. And so when we look at the biblical perspective on it, we notice, hey, it's a holistic act that unites the body and soul, symbolizing commitment, honor, and honoring both parties with dignity, which we see repeatedly. We see Paul talk about this in 1 Corinthians. We see this in Genesis as well. One big way you see it is when Paul says, I'm trying to remember the exact verse. Basically, he says, men, don't you know that your wife owns your body, and wives, don't you know that your husband owns your bodies? And what's very important about that is really the historical context, because that would have been considered wildly weird at the time. Because when you look at historically, the idea was, oh, well, the man, sure, he owns the wife, but the wife, the idea that she has marital rights beyond like the most basic is laughably silly, at least at the time, right? So that's why you end up with men who, you have mass prostitution and all this stuff. But the reason why Paul is saying that is sort of put it in part because it's countercultural, but also in part because he's saying, hey, you both, this act that's between you, it's something that's between only you two, and it's something that you have a duty to keep holy as well. The other biblical perspective is, again, respecting the body. The body is an integral part to who you are. You are not separate from the body, or just separate from the body. Meaning that how you treat your body is important. Thank you, Hopping Rider. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 7:4. It is not the wife who has the rights to her own body, but the husband, and in the same way, it is not the husband who has rights to his own body, but the wife. Thank you. Again, the body, human beings are both body and soul. And so how you treat the body affects the soul, and how you treat the soul will affect the body. If, give a good example, if I'm just eating junk food all the time, it's going to negatively affect my body, and likewise, it's going to negatively affect my mind. Again, studies have been done on this. They show it very clearly. And there's just no way about it. If you're not healthy, you're not going to be able to do things that a healthy person can. Don't worry, Happy Rider. As a college student, I cannot claim I am above eating bad food. And then going on to the third Christian perspective, which is that sex is designed in part, actually, I'll take this back. Sex is primarily designed for children. This is obviously biologically evident. This shouldn't be something arguable. And what that means is you can't just think about it as a pleasure mechanism. Sure, there's great pleasure that may come out of it, but that's not its sole purpose. Its sole purpose is not to make you feel better. And so when you think about it that way, that then changes the perspective you then have on it. So, I'll wait till you're done typing, Crom, before I move on. Or Karen. Or Curran? Curran. Hope I'm saying that name right. I don't know why I said Karen. And I should say, I'm not saying, hey, you have to be pinnacle health at all moments. If you don't have the most perfect BMI and eat only chicken, rice, and broccoli, rice, and chicken, that you are defaming God or something, right? Because that can definitely become an idol. You definitely don't want yourself to become an idol, right? You want self worship, nothing like that. Um, but and you do see that sometimes in certain gym culture, health culture, right? But that doesn't mean that you then get a free pass to just treat yourself like trash. Like we can recognize both extremes and realize, hey, there's a good middle ground. And we shouldn't also forget that gluttony is literally listed as a sinful act. Oh yeah, 100%. Off right. Like something I think of, sometimes people think they'll look at a body. I think actually a good example of this is bodybuilders, right? So if we look at bodybuilders, for the most part, they almost all have high levels of body dysmorphia. Basically meaning that they're very insecure about their body. And so in order to make up for the insecurity, they then get, huge. And when you look at that, it's like, look, you can see an instance of the body is then not being treated right? Because they have something in their mind that's then affecting how they then view the body. And then because of that, they then end up worsening their health. And in some ways, even making an idol out of their own body. Okay, Karen, yeah, if you want to, if you uh, figure out how you want to say, you can just throw it in the chat, or we can talk afterwards if you want. What if I don't want to have kids? That's an important question. Now, obviously, there's a couple different perspectives that are out there. So, if you look at the Catholics, one of the reasons why they're against birth control is they say you should always be open to having kids. That by having birth control, you're interrupting the purpose and design that God has made. So that's why they're like fully against birth control. At least the Catholic churches. You'll have random Catholics that believe all kinds of crazy stuff, but at least the Catholic Church, they believe that. Now, obviously, if you go to more Protestant circles, and I'm going to assume, Orthodox Christian, Orthodox Protestants, I'm not going to include pro-choice, quote unquote. I realize you guys actually can't see me doing air quotes, pro-choice Christians or anything like that. Obviously, some of them tend to be more in favor of it, saying that you don't necessarily have to have kids. My personal perspective, honestly, I haven't made up my mind on. I do think that if you do intend to get married, I think you should have kids. Like that should be kind of like a goal. Because I do think that we are given some quite a few commandments about having kids, and that does seem to be important to marriage. Like that does seem to be like a very key feature. Though again, I haven't made up my mind exactly on it. It's an issue I just haven't spent a lot of time on. I'm trying to think. Honestly, I haven't seen much material on it. I've seen I think Plants with Aquinas had a guy on who talked about it, which is how I got a more complete picture of the Catholic view. But it's just something I haven't spent a lot of time on. And I do think we have to be careful on when we are deciding whether or not is trying to make sure that the reason why we're not is due to selfish reasons. Because I do feel like sometimes when I'm listening to people be like, "Oh, I want kids," and it's like they'll say, "Oh, well, it's about money," and then when you listen closer, you realize, wait a minute, it's really more that you're just not willing to sacrifice anything. Like you want to have a very specific type of life. And by the way, I'm not saying that you are one of these people, Ranger. I just want to make this very clear. I'm not saying that's you. But it is something I have noticed. And I think we do have to be careful of that. Yes, Hopping, you're right. That's completely right. You should 120% discuss this with a good pastor. Like all important issues. Don't let a random person on the internet be the all deciding factor of your theology. I am more than capable of being wrong. I'll wait for you guys to finish typing before I go on. And to go off what you're saying, Hoppy earlier, like obviously we shouldn't pretend like kids are completely easy and that there's no issues that could ever arise. But I think we should try to look like ahead, you know? Like, hey, it's hard now, but ultimately I'm trying to serve God, you know? And I think it can help in growing maturity as well. The procreation, that's procreate. I'll wait for Tito's to finish his 20 quadrillion paragraph response. I almost feel you should just speak Tito's at this point. Oh, there we go. Okay, so with all this being said, again, we can talk about it afterwards as well. We can leave the flow open. Going from here, so when we look at transgenderism, we talked about this earlier, right? Where we have two different philosophies. We have the postmodern and the modernist. So the modernists really are roughly around the Enlightenment period and a little later. Postmodernists tend to show up a little bit after the modernists. And what separates them is the postmodernists believe, when it comes to gender, that gender is the product of societal forces, whereas the modernists view sexuality as just a product of material forces. And so, sort of give an idea of what a separation is, a modernist will be like, the human body dictates your gender, end of discussion, boom, done. Fact, science, done. The postmodernist, however, would be like, oh, well, in my mind, I'm looking at my mind and I say, oh, well, I feel like a girl because the way they view gender is as a performative act. And so effectively, instead of feminine and masculine, they've just replaced it with man and woman. And so in their mind, if you think that you're a woman, then literally you are. Not figuratively, quite literally you are. That they believe these things are just products of political, basically political products that have been made by the dominant classes that is then enforced on the non-dominant classes in order to then further their quote-unquote heteronormative beliefs. And that's basically a very long way of saying the basing force that heterosexuality, male, female, binary are normal. And so they take issue with this. Yes. Yes, literally it is the I think, therefore I am a woman. And so as we move into a more postmodern society, naturally, you end up with the gender unicorn. Now, ignoring the kind of like goofiness and absurdity of a unicorn and the fact that a unicorn doesn't exist, that it's completely fictional and in the mind, which is a little bit ironic. But joking aside, it's important to note that this is something that is specifically meant for public schools. And by public schools, I quite literally mean elementary school and up. I'm going to really get into this next week. I'm currently reading a book called The Queering of the American Child. And we're really going to get into this because he goes way more in depth into some of the infiltration and some of the ideas, the origin of these ideas, and just how detrimental they are. I can't skateboard that I was not a woman, but a demi. Yeah, personality has literally been thrown out the window. Now, to a normal person, you're right. It doesn't make any sense. But I'll get really deep into where these ideas came from and show how they're trying to be consistent within the insane worldview they have. And I do think it's so ridiculous how, as you said, like I don't know, I find am I the only one who thinks it's kind of funny how we went from stereotypes are bad to now stereotypes dictate everything? Like if something is stereotypically masculine and you do it, that means you're a man. And if it's stereotypically feminine and you do it, that means you're automatically a female. Like I don't know. To me, it just seems so bizarre that we went because I remember growing up with everything was about how stereotypes aren't true and how they're ridiculous, blah blah, which is already kind of ridiculous. But we went from that to now like stereotypes dictate literally everything. Like everything literally has become surface deep. Oh, you dress like one, well, therefore you are. I I think I have heard that before. Asking about the beards are oppressive. It's so dumb. Yes, literally. I don't like labels, and only for me label. Now, there is some interesting. I can use the word consistency. It's not really consistency, but in the worldview, there is a reason why this is happening and how it quote unquote makes sense. And it's just insane. Yes, it literally. Well, when you talk about the character creation screen, I mean that is quite literally what the world believes. Not the well, I shouldn't say the world, but these people believe because the human body again, it doesn't have any innate purpose, and so when they look at the human body, they look at it like a creation screen. And I'm really going to get into this when it comes to a lot of the Marxist aspects that have been taken into these movements, the like social Marxism. If you guys haven't read the quote, I posted a quote from the book actually in the quotes channel. Would highly recommend reading it because I thought it was super eye opening on this topic. So actually, I'm going to get into it right now because you sort of brought this up about the stereotypes. So here's what they would say. So when we look at the definition of queer, the way they would define it is queer is everything that is against the norm. And so what some of these queer theorists have written about is what they say is these people, let's say drag queens and so on, what they're doing is they're becoming conscious to the what society is. So basically what they'd say is you have society and these dominant classes dictate what normal is, and then they dictate what is abnormal and deviant. And the reason why they do this is to basically support their own power. It's a power dynamic. Because again, you have to think about this through a Marxist lens. And so what they say is thinking about it through this dynamic, right? The drag queen stuff, they're becoming conscious of how actually all this stuff, male, female, all this stuff, this is just a social political tool. And then what they're doing is by dressing up like a drag queen and stuff, they are mocking it. So how they sort of bring awareness to it is by mocking it, by saying, oh, look, you can't tell what a woman is. Because here's a man dressed up as one. And so that's why they use social these very like character creation screens and stuff like that in order to quote unquote mock the idea of it in order to bring about awareness of it. And you're right, asking part. T does is inconsistent with LGBT, but hear me or yeah, the T is contradicts LGB. But here's the thing. Interesting enough, when you look at queer theorists, they actually have issues with the gays and lesbians. Some of them. And what they call quote unquote homonormativity. Oh, this? Wait, no, it's not this. It's homonormativity. Oh my goodness, these words are ridiculous. And basically, what they'd say is in the community, you have these people who are basically they're not denying gender, sex, or anything. They don't believe it's a social thing. They think it's completely fact. And what they basically say is these people are trying to make their group just normal. Like they're trying to insert themselves within the normal group rather than trying to destroy the idea of the norm. And so you actually have queer theorists who are writing against what they call the straight people of gays and lesbians or something like that. And writing about how that yes. I kid you not. Actually, I might see, you know what, guys? I'm gonna read a passage from the book if you can give me a second. I'm just gonna grab the book. Let's see if I can find it. Call this a little teaser for next week. Where is it? Well, so here's the thing, Jalapeno Writer, is you're thinking of them as grouped together. They're not. They view themselves as opposed. The queer theorists do not agree with traditional gays and lesbians. Because the traditional ones were just trying to argue that there was a norm and that they were in the norm. Which is not at all what queer theory is for. Come on, where is it? Let me figure out what chapter it's in. Hetero. Okay, it's not in that chapter. Heteroactivity. Okay, what is queer theory? Medium answer. Where is this? Short answer. Okay, so here we go. I'll just read a. Yes, they look like they're the same group, but they're not. Here we go. So I'm just gonna quote a bit of the book. So queer theory adopts the idea that cultural norms, science, and institutions that include biology, medicine, psychiatry are used by dominant classes to determine what is a normal, quote unquote, normal man, woman, sexuality are. These dominant classes define themselves as normal, situating themselves in opposition to those they have deemed abnormal and deviant, and creating categories of normal people and abnormal people, and of legitimate ways of being and of deviant ways of being. The dominant classes construct a hierarchy of power where they are privileged. And then, sort of going on, queer theory believes that heteronormativity uses science as a cover for a political project to justify the idea that a person is either a man or woman, and that it is normal for a man or woman to be attracted to the opposite sex. Right? So that's heteronormativity. So skipping a little bit forward. Here we go. In addition, queer theory defines another ideology called homonormativity, which doesn't mean what it sounds like it means. Homonormativity is an ideology that brainwashes people, especially homosexual people, to believe being gay or lesbian is or can be normal, as opposed to intrinsically radical. It convinces people, especially homosexual people, to believe gay and lesbian people should be accepted as a normal variation of human sexuality, and even to pass by dressing and living their lives in ways queer activists deem as to be, quote unquote, coded as, quote unquote, normal. What might be described paradoxically as the straight people of gay people. Queer activists believe being gay or lesbian should be a front of a radical potential and queer activism not just another normal variation of human experience. And so they believe the adoption of homonormativity further oppresses queer people by normalizing homosexuality. So, there you go. The straight people of homosexuals. Yeah. So, sort of a side tangent we went on. Again, we'll get way more into it when I cover the book next week. I'll have a lot of slides dedicated to definitions because there's so many. Like this heteronormativity, which is not to be confused with heteronormativity. Yes, a lot more. A lot more. We're going to be defining a lot of terms. Mainly because, like normal Marxists, they redefine a lot of things, and so you have to have definitions for them to understand the coded language. I can see why you think that, and I agree with you. However, the weird thing is there isn't a double think. if you take on their axioms, it's quite logical. The problem is their axioms are trash. Kind of like Marxism. Well, actually, just like Marxism, because Marxism is actually the founding for a lot of these ideas. Just like every bad idea in the 21st century. I should probably put in some memes of Jordan Peterson yelling postmodern. Sort of lighting up the slides. Postmodernist. Yes. Okay, so let's land the plane. So here's some things I think we should think about. After going through this, what are some practical lessons we can take? And I think one of them we do have to be careful is taking extremes. So one of these extremes is not the idea of gender roles, but taking them too far. So there's almost no question that if you look at the Bible, it clearly defines some things. If you don't believe me, you can watch Mike Winger's like quadrillion-hour video on the subject. Every time he posts a video, I swear it's longer and longer. Probably the only actual infinity that exists in real life. But anyways, beyond that, we can definitely take it too far. So you can have some people who take the very simple commands, and in order to try to avoid getting close to them, they then flippantly apply them to everything. Like everything has a role. Like, oh, you picked up a water ball. Well, that has a role. And you can definitely go way too far with that. And so I do think we have to be careful with that. And one of the issues with taking it too far is you can end up with people who, let's say, are slightly more feminine or masculine, who then prefer things that are stereotypically done by the opposite sex. So, for example, like we have Jalapeno right here, right? You like wearing pants, playing games, and skateboarding. Those are traditionally male stereotype things, right? It would do a disservice to the church to be like, oh, because this is a stereotype, therefore, boom, only men can do this. Because then you end up just pushing people away. Or, you have a guy who really likes taking care of children, they tend to prefer the teaching stuff. Being like, oh, well, clearly you can't do that. Because, stereotypically, only women can do that. If we do these extremes, all we end up doing is pushing people outside of church who aren't doing anything wrong. And we do need to be careful of that. Another thing we have to be careful about is, again, saying that, oh, well, roles should be determined, masculine and feminine should be determined by specific personality traits. Yes, if you take a group of 100 people in one group, 100 people in another group, you can come up with general trends on, hey, this is what personality is going to be like. Hey, here's what personality is going to be like. But that doesn't mean that just because something applies to a group overall, that therefore, if you look at individuals, you can't have variation. Obviously you have to look at individuals and decide from there. And I also think it's very important to not conflate cultural values into biblical teachings or cultural views. To give I think an abundantly obvious one is when people think of who works outside the home and who works inside the home. Post Industrial Revolution, there is a binary that's then made there, right? Where now men are going outside the home, they're going to factories, they're working, then they're coming back. But if we go pre-industrialization, what we see is actually, guess what? Both people are working. Everyone's working. Women are working, men are working, right? And so we want to be careful of not looking at these traditional cultural values and being like, oh, because these were done in the past, that therefore, boom, Christian value. That's not necessarily the case. And as we all know, Christian values are supposed to infiltrate the world, not the other way around. We're supposed to be a light to the world, not have the world then determine our values. And so we do have to be careful of that. Anything anyone else wants to add? If I move on to the last slide. Boom. So here are some other practical applications. One thing that is obviously important is, hey, in your life, you're going to be dealing with some of these people. who have been sucked into this absolute cult, this disgusting cult that tells a bunch of lies and ultimately harms people. Well, you have to recognize that there are some mental issues that are often at play, especially again with gender dysmorphia, body dysmorphia, all these things. And we have to recognize, again, these people are made in the image of God. They have the same value as you. They are loved by God as much as you are. And so you should try to show the same type of love that Jesus showed people and living that out in your life. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you then neglect truth. I think one of the worst things you've done in society is think that just because, in order to be compassionate, that means you have to just agree to everything someone else believes, which is completely untrue. One of my favorite quotes is from Thomas Sowell. Oh, what does he say? But it's something along the lines of, no one hates another person more than someone who lies to them. If you just lie to someone in order to quote unquote love them, like, oh, well, I'll just, ignore these issues and not try to help you. Like, you're not actually loving the person. If someone's dealing with the drug addiction and all you're doing is affirming them, quote unquote, you're not actually loving them. Someone who actually loves them would try to stop them and try to help them seek help. And the thing is, again, speak truth in love. Sometimes people have a view of, well, if I just say something that's true, that's okay. Not really. The way you tell the truth can be unloving. And as Paul again says in Corinthians, someone who says, even if you have the faith to move mountains, but you don't have the love in your heart, you sound like nothing but a noisy gong. Right? You're just making a bunch of noise. You're a nuisance. So you have to remember to be loving. Yes. Thank you, Mexico. 1 Peter 3:15. But set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts and always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks about the hope you possess. Yep. Good stuff. Oops. Yeah, you're right. Words spoken without tact are rarely effective. And I mean, it's just so obvious, Like, if someone came up to you and was just like, blah, 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 you're probably not going to take that well, Like, try to treat others the way you would expect to be treated. I know everyone thinks that, oh, well, I'm the toughest man ever. I could take it, bro. But chances are, guess what? You also an emotional being. And if you felt that someone was disrespecting you, you probably weren't going to take them as seriously as if you thought they were. Oh, yeah, there it is. Mexican pop star. 16, yet do it with courtesy and respect, keeping a good conscience, so that those who slander your good conduct in Christ may be to shame when they accuse you, or put to shame when they accuse you. Good stuff. Remember, when God said that they would hate you because they hated me first, he didn't mean that you couldn't be a crappy person, where that was the only reason they could hate you. They can hate you because you suck too. Thank you for the quote from Thomas Sowell. When you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. Great quote from a great man. So our third sort of practical takeaway is, again, affirm our identity in Christ. As we hear about identity thrown around all the time, oh, here's my sexual identity, or here's my gender identity, all this nonsense made up by Marxists. Our only true identity is in Christ. Right? Christ is the head of any discussion we have. And so we should be comparing us to Christ and making sure that our ways are in alignment with his, rather than us trying to contort his ways into ours. Always don't be a progressive Christian. And I mean that in the very specific way, where you try to contort your political beliefs as Christ is. Instead of letting Christ change your, instead of aligning yourself with Christ, you try to align Christ with you. Don't do that. Our next one is promote a biblical understanding of sexuality. Again, as Christians, we believe that God put purpose in creation, that he made things with a purpose, and that his ways are perfect And so we should be making sure that we align our beliefs on this with it. Why? It's the same way, like, let's imagine I make a tool. I make you a drill. And I give you the drill and I give you instructions on how to use the drill. Guess what? If you don't follow the instructions on how to use the drill, it's not going to function properly. In the same way, if we take these tools that God has given and we misuse them, they're not going to function properly. Oh, last one, and I think this one was really important. Something I've really spent way more time thinking about is your holy temple, or your body's a holy temple. And because our body's a holy temple, we should be seriously consider how we are treating our bodies. We should really make sure not to fall into the mindset of, oh, well, our bodies are just, whatever for me to use. However I want to use it, I'm going to use it. That really, it's disrespectful to the guy who gave you the body. Remember, your body's on loan from him. As it says, you were bought with a price. Don't you know your bodies aren't your own? And so we see looking at like, hey, how can I better use my body to glorify God? And I do think some of the practical applications of that is, hey, try and eat healthy. Try to take care of yourself. Don't take on unnecessary risks for just no other reason than just to do it. Yeah. I yearn for a day where Christians are the healthiest group of people, because we'll have so much more energy that we can then be spending furthering the kingdom. And you can better take care of each other. They can't outrun us then. That is true. If we are the healthiest people, they can't outrun us. I guess we won't be sneaky sheeps as much as speeding cheetahs. Right, Toodles? I mean, that's kind of an inside joke, but... And again, I think we do have to be careful. Like, you don't want to go too far, right? So you have some people who will act like, oh, well, don't you know? If you take a sip of alcohol, technically, it has a damaging effect on you. Sure, it might be so incredibly minor that we aren't really able to calculate it. But don't you know? Like, obviously, don't go that far. I'm reminded of the guy who's trying to live like as long as humanly possible, and he's like doing all these weird treatments, like he's taking blood out of his son and putting it in his veins because I guess it'll help him theoretically de-age himself slightly. Like, you look at that and it's like, okay, that's someone who fears death, and now he's turned his body into an idol. That's wrong. Like, that's unchristian. But likewise, like, come on, let's try to do better. Exactly right. Like, oh well, the sun has a damaging effect. Therefore, do not go out in the sun. It's like, no. What it means is, hey, maybe put on sunscreen. Don't fry yourself. Unless you're one of the lucky few who don't fry. That is true. You're definitely right, Mexican, specifically about seriously committed Christians. Cultural Christians, effectively the same as non-Christians, but if you're talking about people who are actually committed, who go to church regularly, who pray regularly, who read regularly, yes, that's 1,000% true. Yeah, you're right. It is a balance, and again, also think about how it can help you better serve too. I think that's also important, right? Because you may think, oh, how am I better serving someone by working out? Like, well, first of all, if you're healthy, guess what? That means you can help people who aren't healthy. If you're completely out of shape and someone needs help, you're probably not going to be able to help them. Like, I'm not in the greatest shape myself, but I remember I was working on a job site cleaning windows. I did that for a summer. And there was a guy, he had, it was a couple neighbors down, and they'd come to grab me because it was this older gentleman, and he just couldn't stand by himself. And so they needed someone to sort of help him out. And again, I'm not like in pinnacle shape by any stretch of the imagination, but it's also true that if I wasn't at least in okay shape, I wouldn't have been able to help out the person. Yeah, it does make housework easier. And also, if you have like, you know, kids and stuff, like if you don't have good energy because you're really out of shape, you're not going to be able to hang out with them, do stuff with them. And also, I do think it's kind of abusive if you don't make sure that your kids are healthy, because that comes with all kinds of negative effects down the line. And again, ultimately, we're trying to honor God, and God has given us these temples, and He's bought us with a price. And so, as such, we should, in our love for God, then love ourselves. And that means taking care of ourselves. So, maybe, like all these meetings, I go on way longer than I think I am. Does anyone have any questions about anything said? Yes, you're right, Tios. It does help with that too. That's so important. Awesome. So again, next week we're gonna talking about I'm gonna define all these terms I threw out there like heteronormativity, homonormativity, cis heteronormativity, and cultural Marxism, queer theory, queer Marxism, CRT, all this stuff. All this stuff. We're gonna be talking about all that next week. So should be a very dense meeting. So prepare yourselves. Maybe run a mile, make sure you're in good shape for it. Yes, I do suspect it's going to be a longer class, assuming I do a good job.